Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode is brought to you by Rollbar. Rollbar is real-time error monitoring, alerting, and analytics that helps you resolve production errors in minutes. And I talked with Paul Bigger, the founder of Circle CI, a trusted customer of Rollbar, and Paul says they don't deploy a service without installing Rollbar first. It's that crucial to them.
We operate at serious scale, and literally the first thing we do when we create a new service is we install Rollbar in it. Like we need to have that visibility, and without that visibility, it would be impossible to run at the scale we do, and certainly with the number of people that we have. Like we're a relatively small team operating a major service, and without the visibility that Rollbar gives us into our exceptions, it just wouldn't be possible.
All right, if you want to follow in Paul's footsteps and start deploying with confidence today, head to rollbar.com/changelog. Once again, rollbar.com/changelog.
Welcome to JS Party, a community celebration of JavaScript and the web. Quick heads up, this episode does have some swearing. We normally bleep swear words, but in this case, it's just one word. It's repeated quite a bit, and it also is part of the conversation. You'll understand once you get there. So if you're listening with sensitive ears nearby, you might want to wait for a better time, but otherwise, here we go.
All right. Hello, JS Party people. This is KBall reporting live from JAMStack Conf SF. I'm here with Katie Sylor-Miller, front-end architect at Etsy.
Yes, as of today.
As of today. That's amazing.
Yeah, big day.
So I'm going to ask you about front-end architecture and architecting because I think that's a good thing. But first, let's talk about your talk.
Yes.
So you had a talk here at JAMStack Conf yesterday. Is that
yes,
right?
Yesterday.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So my talk was called Git on the JAMStack. So a couple years ago, like 3 years ago now, I made this ridiculous website called OhShitGit, which is a list of problems that I got into with Git all the time, and then a list of steps on how to solve them. And the website kind of went viral extremely unexpectedly to me.
I feel like the name of it just captures a common sentiment among developers.
Yeah, no, I think that was like the key to success, is that I came up with this ridiculous and memorable name for the website, and it surprisingly was still available to buy the domain.
That's amazing. Okay, so talking about that and the JAMStack?
Yeah, exactly. So Phil reached out to me and was like, hey, you want to come and talk at this conference? And I was like, cool. I didn't even know what the JAMStack was. I had to go Google it. I'd heard about it, of course. People are talking about it around the industry, but, I didn't remember what JAM stood for. And so I was kind of like, are you sure you really want me to talk at your conference? And he was like, no. Like, Git is such a huge core component of the JAMStack, and I'd love it if you could come and talk about Git. So, I talk about Git a lot. I've given talks many times and workshops. And so I kind of use this as motivation to go out and learn about the JAMStack and how Git powers the JAMStack. And so I did that by actually taking OhShitGit, which had been an index.html file that I crafted in about 2 hours 3 years ago, and actually moved it into Git for the first time, and rebuilt it with Eleventy as a static page builder. And
There's
now,
something ironic about OhShitGit not living in Git.
Right?
For the first
I know.
few years of its
it was
existence.
almost like a badge of honor at first. Like, people would be like, oh, is it in Git? Can I link to it? And I would be like, no.
This is as old school as you get.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, and for a lot of years, people have been reaching out and asking, "Hey, can I translate your content into my language?" And my answer was usually, "That's a great idea, but not now," because there really wasn't a good mechanism for people to submit new translations. So I kind of, used this conference and this talk as motivation to enable that. And so now it's been translated into German. I think I've had people volunteer for French, Serbian, Turkish, Russian, Portuguese. So none of those are complete yet, but they're coming. So
do you get them to make more inventive cursing for each one? 'Cause,
yeah, it's funny. So the guidance that I gave and the instructions is basically like, I use a lot of idioms and a lot of swears that, probably don't translate directly. And I say, just be free. And just all I ask is that you keep the oh shit part in some way, whatever the equivalent of oh shit is in your language. So,
right.
Scheisse in German, I guess.
Oh, Scheisse, Geisse. Dear. So first experience with JAMStack stuff, then rebuilding this. How'd you feel? Because I know a lot of our listeners are probably looking at this and saying, that looks kind of interesting, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think, it's my favorite thing by far, especially I decided to use Netlify for hosting, and I decided to use 11T just because it was the simplest and quickest and easiest setup. And I know Zach personally, so I can reach out to him and bother him with questions.
It always helps to know the maintainers or the authors of these frameworks. Be like, this doesn't make sense.
Right? But I think it's great. I think to me, the real killer feature was, I wanted to move into this stack and then basically immediately re-architect the entire page. I've just brought over my flat index.html file.
Right. And
then I went through the re-architecting, and by using a separate branch in Git and then using branch deploy previews via Netlify, I had this.
So freaking amazing,
oh my God,
by the way. Okay, I'm going to push this up and I get a preview right away. I can send it to someone else. I can send it to me.
Cool. Cool. I don't, I'm assuming that, these kinds of things don't happen in isolation, and Netlify probably was not the first people to think of this, but there's just something about it that makes so much sense.
The execution that they have there is awesome as well.
It was so seamless, and it really allowed me to feel comfortable re-architecting the site and going out and testing and looking at it and making sure that all of the redirects work. I mean, the fact that you can even set up individual redirects in a, basically a TOML file, and then push that out to your branch, and the branch handles all of the redirects the same way that the regular site would. It really made it so easy. So I think, especially for blogging sites, OhShitGit's not necessarily a blog site, but it's kind of similar in a way that it's you create the content and it just stays the same, and it's not very dynamic. And so I think it's a really, really good fit, basically. Yeah. So, and there's been a lot of I have been learning a lot from this conference about the way cooler stuff that the JAMStack can do.
I know. Yeah, I keep dabbling my toes in. I recently launched a new site that is essentially a blog, right? But I'm like, okay, what can I do with this? This is fun. This is exciting.
Yeah, so, totally.
Yeah, there's some neat stuff going on. So you mentioned something that is going to segue me back into talking with you about something we talked about earlier, which is you said, you re-architected it.
Yeah.
And you just got promoted to front-end architect.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about what that even means in the front end. What does front-end architecture entail in your mind?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. So I think we have all of these product teams at Etsy who are going out, and they're focused really on features and products. And then we have our front-end infrastructure teams, which I have been on, my time at Etsy. I've always been on front-end infrastructure. And there's this problem where when you're in infrastructure, you're not building product. You're thinking about the longer term and the bigger picture, and you want to make sure that you're providing tools and workflows that work for product engineers.
Right.
Because frankly, product engineers don't always have time to think about that. They're under time constraints. They have deadlines. They have financial goals they need to meet. So it's kind of been growing organically for a long time that I was moving more into looking at strategy overall and making connections with folks on product teams and reaching out to them and really being like, what are your stumbling blocks? What do you need? And then on the other side of things, Etsy, we have this philosophy of using boring tech, which in the front end space, I love it as well. But I think that in the front end space, it resulted in us falling behind the times.
Right.
And we've been working really hard to modernize our stack and get off of our, we just switched from our old homegrown required JS build system that was built in 2011 to Webpack finally. So there's a lot of different pieces of the stack that we need to modernize, and somebody needs to figure out how we're going to do that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting problem, because I like this philosophy of use boring tech is essentially saying, as I understand it, and you would know better than I did, but as I understand it, don't get shiny object syndrome.
Yep.
Right? Do what's going to work to solve the problem at hand without getting pulled into, I got to microservice this and I got to, bundle all this and whatever else is. But the challenge is you still don't want to build up lots of tech debt.
Yeah.
And you still don't want to, fall behind in terms of capabilities because, yes, oftentimes the boring tech is good enough, but sometimes you lose a lot of productivity staying in boring tech because there are actual breakthroughs that happen.
Totally. And I think that's something that we've seen is, we have two different parts of the site. So there's like the public facing site that everyone goes to when they're shopping on Etsy. And then there's a whole back end site for the people who are selling their homemade items on the site. And for a long time, there's been this split where the seller backend was built first in Backbone and Marionette, and then a couple of years ago, I think in 2015, we started switching over to React, and now it's entirely built in React. But then our front end buyer side, because we haven't said, okay, we're going to accept the challenges of building a spa that actually works, because obviously SEO is huge for us.
Yep.
Performance is huge for us.
Yep.
So we had this mostly like jQuery based JavaScript ecosystem in our buyer front end, but it's getting to the point now where teams aren't just working on buyer or seller; they're working across the product,
Yep.
And it's hard to have transferable skills between the two.
Yeah, well, and hard to have consistent design systems if you have to have totally different implementations and consistent interactions.
Yeah, no, it's funny actually. So for a long time, my team owned the design system at Etsy, and we actually built an entire framework that would allow us to have a core vanilla JavaScript file for all of our design system components that would then either get wrapped up in vanilla.js to handle all of the DOM manipulation, or it would get wrapped up in a React component that would handle the React lifecycle and all of that, because we were like, everything's getting so out of sync. One version's accessible, the other version isn't. The functionality is slightly different.
Yep.
So, and I think also too that, we hire a lot of folks who come out of boot camps, and they don't understand jQuery. They've never used it. They've never seen it. They don't have to worry about this.
Yeah.
And how all the crazy hoops you jump through to maintain what this is, because they're used to ES6. They're used to building everything in React, building a node on the server.
Yeah, that is interesting. That's the other side of boring tech is, does that mean boring engineers?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
or maybe I should say bored engineers?
Yeah. No, I think it leads to frustrated engineers. And it leads to frustrated infrastructure folks like myself because, we see code that we know is not performant, that we know isn't written the best way, but I don't blame the engineers at all because they're used to this completely different programming paradigm.
Yep.
And you kind of throw them in and say, here you go. So that's one of the big things that we're working on is figuring out how to do how to do server-side React rendering and then hydration on the client so that we can do we can share components, we can share knowledge, but we don't sacrifice SEO and performance.
This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the simplest cloud platform for developers and teams with products like Droplets, Spaces, Kubernetes, load balancers, block storage, and pre-built one-click apps. You can deploy, manage, and scale cloud applications faster and more efficiently on DigitalOcean. Whether you're running one virtual machine or 10,000, DigitalOcean makes managing your infrastructure way too easy. Head to do.co/changelog. Again, do.co/changelog.
Are you looking at Next, or is that because you've got so much established stuff you can't really go with a framework like that?
Yeah, so I think what we're looking at right now, Airbnb has an open source thing called Hypernova, which is basically a server that you pass it a React component and a bunch of context data, and then it will render the HTML and return it to you. Mm-hmm. So what we've been exploring first is basically taking that and bolting it into our existing PHP framework. So we're like a big PHP shop.
Right.
And basically, instead of using, right now we have mustache files that we render on the server. There would be a way to sort of indicate, okay, this particular PHP view uses a JSX file instead,
right.
And then it would go off and come back. The service would come back with the rendered markup, which we'd inject into the rest of the page, which is still probably coming from PHP.
Right.
And then that way,
you basically use it as an external templating engine. You pass off PHP data as JSON that becomes context and renders are interesting.
Exactly.
Okay, now I'm curious.
Well, we're super early in the process, so.
Yeah. Well, so I'll ask questions, and if you don't know, you don't know.
Okay.
But so what's I assume you're having the server co-located, so it's on the same node as the PHP server where it's running, or are you going over a network hop to render that template?
So we are all in Google Cloud at this point. So I think that what we're looking at right now is that it would be a separate service running in Google App Engine. So it is effectively an HTTP request, but it's all happening internal to our Google Cloud clusters.
So what kind of latency do you see from that?
We don't know yet. We just have a proof of concept that just started. But my hope is that we can do a lot of caching. I'm thinking, obviously we're going to have to wait and see what kind of features people are going to want to build out with this. But I'm guessing a lot of it is going to be things like, a hard problem is sorting and filtering in search results, right? Like, I'm hopeful that the markup for that isn't going to change a ton. It's more the items themselves that we display. And so I think it's going to require a lot of consideration and thought on how we structure the modules so that we can cache as much as possible and then reduce the surface area of the really dynamic content that's actually going to need to go all the way to the Hypernova service.
Yeah, though interesting. So can you send it a set of requests in one HTTP request?
Yeah, I think we're getting a little outside of. So my colleague Allie Jones is actually the one who's been working on the proof of concept, but I believe that it's parallelizable. possible. I could be wrong.
Interesting. Because
if it isn't parallelizable, we should make it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, thinking about, right, like in that server-side world, which is, I think some of our folks are in that world there with Node and things like that. Like network requests are the most expensive thing.
Yep.
And so imagining this situation, you either are going to want to do it like at the page level where you're just like, okay, this whole page is React and I'm going to do one fetch and it's going to render everything over there. Almost where like PHP is just your data layer and then you're passing that over. Or you'd want to have like, here's the set of components I need and I send them all in one request and get them all back.
Yeah.
But,
I think we're definitely more on the latter side of things because, just thinking long term about what the rollout plan is going to look like. I mean, it'll probably start with we'll pick one component on the page. Maybe it's the logged in user menu or something like that. That's highly interactive, or maybe it's our conversations UI.
Right.
And we'll just pick that one little tiny piece of the page and then just start there.
Yeah.
With the expectation that, a lot of the stuff that we serve in our markup, it's not dynamic. It doesn't need to be
in React.
It doesn't need to be React.
I love that because that lets you migrate gradually, which is something that is so often neglected in this ecosystem because we're like, okay, just use the latest and greatest thing. That doesn't work if you have a massive existing application.
No, that's always the hardest problem, I think, in infrastructure is figuring out how do you do rollouts effectively? How do you stay on top of adoption? We have a lot of things that are still kind of hanging around 7, 8, 9 years later because we didn't focus as much as we probably should have on getting full adoption. And then it becomes this like compounding problem where when we want to try to build new things, we have to accommodate the 4 different historical architectures of Etsy.com that are still lingering in various corners of the code base. So, all of our new infrastructure projects take twice as long as they probably should. Because we have to backfill.
It all has to keep running.
Yeah.
Right? You can't start from scratch. You got a business going.
Exactly. So it's kind of funny. We have a really big culture of rotations and boot camps at Etsy where folks can go and hang out on another team for a week or a month and just sort of get a taste for what other people are doing. And we've had multiple product engineers come and hang out with us. And at the end, they're like, I don't want to be an infrastructure engineer. I don't know how you do what you do. And I'm like, honestly, I don't know how you do. I could never be a product engineer again. Someone would be like, hey, Katie, can you go build this feature? And I would be like, okay, here's a framework for building that feature. That's going to make it more maintainable and robust and easier to build. And so for life, I'm an infrastructure engineer for life.
Yeah. So I'm curious to explore this more because this kind of migration question is something that I think that it's underserved in terms of educational content for folks. So you mentioned there's like 4 existing legacy architectures that I imagine you're trying to gradually remove at least some of the older ones. So what's the process for, okay, we've decided we're moving on from this approach. How do you get there, get to the next approach from there?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is, and I will be 100% honest that I think this is something that we're still constantly learning about. It's a really hard problem and we don't always get it right. But I think a lot of it starts with thinking about developer experience. And, I joke that I'm not a feature or a product developer, but really I am. And it's the product, though, that I'm building is for other engineers. And I think you have to have a lot of empathy and a lot of concern and care to make sure that the underlying structure of what you are building doesn't leak into the API that you expose for engineers to use, and that the API works in a way that that the engineers who are using it think about it, And so you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's going to be using this and thinking what's going to be the easiest way for them to switch to using this.
Right.
And then I think it's just about partnering with teams, getting folks to like start to use what you built and have success with it. And then they share that, and then other people start getting excited and want to use it too.
So that gives me some about how you get them on the new thing, but how do you get rid of the old thing?
Oh God, it's hard. Ownership is a big problem. I don't know. I honestly don't know if other large organizations have this problem, but
I would wager they do.
I would wager they probably do, but yeah, that's something that we struggle with. Is what do we do with all of these really old features that, for whatever reason, we don't want to get rid of, but nobody's actively working on them.
Yeah.
Because honestly, the upgrade path for that is probably non-existent. So I think something I've been kind of toying around with is coming up with a framework for like, okay, let's rank our pages. A lot of times we rank things based on how much they contribute to like conversion or seller happiness or seller growth. And then we have these other pages though where it's not clear what their value is.
Right.
And maybe we need to sort of accept the fact that we're always going to have parts of the site that we're never going to upgrade or touch. And maybe what we need to do is wall them off into like a walled garden. Yeah. Where we don't worry about the fact that we're duplicating code or that we are, taking copies of files that we're updating other places, but just sort of saying, okay, here be dragons. We accept that here be dragons, and we're not going to try to ever bring this forward. Because let's be realistic, that's what happens.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's something I've been kind of talking and thinking about with people a lot. Is like, all right, can we make some walled gardens of code where we're not going to invest the time and energy that it takes to upgrade it until, as an organization, we decide that it's important.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Because a migration path I've seen before or done before is you have sort of this walled garden of this is the old stuff. Or sometimes you start with, you have a walled garden that this is the new and beautiful stuff. And then you gradually, piece by piece, try to move things between one and the other. But you treat them completely differently. Yeah,
I think the pattern that we've generally used is more of like a hybrid where we make the new stuff backwards compatible with the old stuff so you can kind of mix and match, which has it's as with everything, there's trade-offs, like the trade-off with that is that the old stuff has a tendency to stick around longer, but it makes it easier to do like a gradual rollout. I think what is it like the strangler pattern? Have you heard of like the strangler pattern?
I think so, but let's review it.
It's a terrible name, but basically the idea is that you it's like a strangler vine grows around a tree and then gradually eats the tree away and replaces it. So I think the idea is that you build new stuff around the old stuff and slowly kind of eat away at it until the old stuff is gone. I could be butchering that. I apologize in advance if I butchered what the strangler pattern means.
It's a very graphic metaphor for code. Okay, we're going to wrap it up in this new stuff, and Webpack is slowly going to strangle the life out of our old code. Yeah. Not to pick on Webpack, but
no. I like Webpack. I'm glad we actually have it now. So
yeah, it's fun because it's easy to hate on Webpack because there are so many configuration challenges as far as they've come, but there's a reason we all keep adopting it too.
Yeah.
If you go back to the older ways, like you can't do a lot of the things you can now do with Webpack. And it's hard, but like complexity is conserved. It's got to be somewhere.
Yep. Well, we have a team of 3 people whose entire job it was for a year was to figure out how to migrate us onto Webpack. So it's not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it was worth it. We, again, with the boring tech, we sort of it took us a little while, but once it became pretty clear that Webpack was like the de facto standard, and the support is there, the maintenance is there, we said, okay, it's time to start using it.
This episode is brought to you by Algolia, search technology to power your business. Trusted by Twitch, Stripe, Adobe, and many more. Even us. Yes, we use them to power our search, and we love the way they obsess over that developer experience. They let us fine-tune the index for the best results and report back what people are searching for, even surfacing search terms that get 0 results, which we love. Check the show notes for a link to get started for free, or head to algolia.com to learn more.
Another topic I wanted to pick your brain on, though I'm supposed to get away from using that metaphor because that's also a little bit of a weird visual
this
there.
This is a Halloween episode.
I know, right? Another topic I wanted to ask you about, to not try any metaphors, is design systems. Because I saw that you were one of the authors of the Design System Handbook that I think InVision sort of coalesced together from different folks, and you brought it up a little bit. So tell us a little bit about how you think about design system. What makes a good one? How do you develop it?
Yeah, I think, so, design systems to me, I think is this natural progression that, I've been doing this for almost 15 years. And throughout that time, I mean, it's had a lot of different names. First it was Style Guide, and then Component Library. And, it just makes sense. Every other like computing language uses small reusable modules of code. So, I mean, it's an idea that just makes sense. But I think that, again, kind of like what I said before, the difference between a successful design system and an unsuccessful one is really putting care into that API. And thinking about, all right, how, the way that you build a custom drop-down component to handle your specific product use case versus the way that you build something that is completely reusable and exposes an API so that allows multiple different teams to inject their own data and their own interaction into a component that handles opening it, animating it. How do you surface what the user selected? How do you handle accessibility is a huge challenge for things like that. It's a completely different mindset. And systems thinking has to go into every layer of the design system, basically. And I think it's really exciting that several years ago, I was probably 8 or 9 years ago now that at my job, I suggested that we create a reusable pattern library because I was getting so frustrated that, it's like the 50 Shades of Grey. Like every single photo, every single Photoshop document, because it was Photoshop then, they sent to me had 4 different grays and they weren't standard and nothing. And I was like, for the love of God, please give me something that I can reuse.
Yes.
And I think at that point the designers were kind of like, what? But it seems to me that designers are like much more on board. A lot of organizations, and at Etsy actually, our design system initially came out of designers, not engineers. Yeah. Which I think is amazing. Yeah. And I'm really glad to see this kind of component-based development becoming a thing because it makes so much sense on so many levels.
Yes. Okay. So let me dig a little deeper into that. So you mentioned systems thinking at each level of the design system. So can you maybe play out first, what are the layers of the design system that you're thinking of? And then maybe highlight a little bit about how systems thinking influences each one?
Okay. Yeah. So I think, it's sort of, if you think about, Brad Frost introduced kind of the atomic design language a long time ago, and I think a lot of it still makes sense. You kind of start with like, what are your colors? What are your fonts? What are your icons? Thinking about putting together a color palette that is something that designers can mix and match and express creativity, but also it meets accessibility requirements, that you have strong guidelines about, well, you never use the light gray on a white background. It only can be used for text on a black background, and so to me, I think that's one of the hardest pieces, and I'm glad that I work with really talented designers who can visually come up with, okay, this is what the visual and informational hierarchy of text on the page is. That's the hardest part of any design system, I think, is something that you can reuse. And then from there, it's really thinking about components and what are the smallest pieces of your components. A lot of times, a button might be, I feel like that's the canonical thing for design systems, because buttons are everywhere.
Buttons are everywhere. You'd like to think they're simple. They are not simple.
They are not simple at all. And, I think, again, it kind of thinking about how do you write your CSS in such a way? I think a lot of folks have adopted this idea of having a structural class and then themed classes, and just thinking about the interactions between those, and what options do you expose to people? How do you allow them to make the button bigger? How do you allow them to make the text bigger? What happens if they want to put an icon inside of a button? What happens if the text wraps onto multiple lines? There's so many things you have to think about to build a component that seems so utterly simple.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a button that submits a form versus a button that opens a custom dropdown? What about a button that changes the pagination? What does that look like? How do you build that? So, and then from there, once you get into the more kind of complicated, the interaction with a button is relatively easy, although obviously the thinking about it is not. With your components, that idea again of what are the smallest units that I can build, and how do they interact with each other and build up in order to make something really complicated, like a modal overlay dialog box, something like that. That is, it's massive in terms of making sure that the entire page is structured correctly, so that a screen reader knows when this accessible dialog box is open, that it should ignore everything else on the page. You have to know how to capture the focus and the tabbing, the handle tab order. So there's all these like really deep underlying facets to the interaction, but then there's also like, how do I make it so that designers can use different sizes of it? What happens if they want to have a header or a footer that stays fixed in the modal and then the rest of it scrolls because it's taking over the whole page? What about mobile? Like, what about the tap interactions? So, I mean, it really, there's so much complexity on every single level, and to me, the best design systems abstract away all of that complexity, and the folks who are like, the designers and the developers who use it, maybe they don't even know that all that stuff is happening in the background. They just know that they can combine it and it does what they want,
Yeah. That's interesting. It's almost like, so as we talked about, there's the implementation piece of this, but as you're talking about, there's thinking that is architectural thinking, but design, right? So I don't know if I've ever seen the title design architect, but it's almost like you need that separation of like, there's a little bit of, okay, this person is specializing in graphical design, what the thing looks like. This person's focusing on, information architecture, I guess is the closest area that I've heard, but that's really interesting.
And honestly, I think I've worked with, several designers in the last 4 years at Etsy on building this design system, and they all are like design architects. They think about those higher questions. They have a systems mindset, you know? And to me, I think that systems mindset really, it transcends just software architecture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's super cool. I'm still like spinning thinking about design.
I could talk about design systems all day.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. So maybe the thing I would ask, if thinking about a design system from now the perspective of a front-end developer, what are the key pieces in terms of designing that API that are going to make a difference in the engineering utilization there?
Well, I think a lot of it really depends. So there's a couple of different ways to approach how you build a design system. So some design systems just provide, here's a bunch of CSS classes and some example markup, and you go out and you build it in whatever language you're going to use, and you just use our classes, and you use our markup structure, and you sort of handle everything else. And then there's all the way through to we provide all of the components to you, basically. Yeah. And I think the interesting thing about the API is a lot of times those components might be PHP markup or some other like server-side language, or these days most likely it's probably like React or Vue components. And you want to have an API where engineers can pass in properties that correspond to the, sort of like the CSS classes that you're going to apply. So if they pass in, button is huge, then it applies the button huge class.
Right.
And I think thinking about the translation from a CSS class to a consistent property that you pass in a JavaScript component is really interesting. And then I think there's a lot around, the design system that we use. We sort of provide these structural classes and themes, but then we allow folks to heavily modify. We have, I think like Bootstrap does this, Tailwind does this, where you have like margin classes, padding classes, borders, text colors. So there's a lot of thinking you have to do about, okay, so if someone is building this button and they want to pass through additional classes and parameters, having your React component set up to allow those properties to just get passed right through into the markup that gets output is really important. I think, because there's a balance, right? Like you can't have a property for every single possible thing that people are going to want to do with your components. So it's really about thinking, okay, how can I make it so that it's really clear when I pass in this prop? What's the markup going to look like when it comes out the other side?
There's kind of a deliberate constraints thing too, right? Like an engineer might not be thinking about the fact that there are only certain spacings that fit within the design and the design system. And so by making that something that you're passing in where there's like, I don't know, 3 different margin classes or something like that, you don't get engineers who are like, wait, but if I try to measure this with my pixel thing, it's actually 14 pixels instead of 15 pixels.
No. That's I think honestly, that's just something that I work really hard to try to help engineers feel empowered to push back on designs that don't follow the system.
Yes.
Like I generally tell them, I'm like, if the designer hands you something that doesn't exist in the system, go out and build it with the system as close as you can get it to their design, show it to them, say, is this acceptable? And then if they say, no, this isn't quite right, that's when you can have a conversation about the trade-offs of writing custom markup, writing custom CSS, maintaining that in the long term versus using what's available. Or then you can have a conversation with your design systems team or whoever owns your design system about, hey, these patterns don't fit what my designers want to do anymore. So maybe we need to expose a new class or a new variable, or maybe a whole new pattern needs to be developed. So I think a lot of times engineers, especially more junior engineers, they'll get handed a design and they'll measure it and they'll go and they'll build it exactly. But if there's a good system in place, you should never have to do that. You should never have to do that. You should never want to do that.
Yes, that's a great way to unmaintainable CSS.
Exactly.
And
exactly. Yeah. This is how we got. This is it's exactly that thing, which is why design systems exist in the first place, is to solve those problems.
So this raises another related and interesting question, which is, how do you think about the evolution of a design system? Because we'd all love to create the one perfect thing and then always be able to use it. And that's not reality, right? Like reality evolves and changes and our constraints change and things like that. So how do you think about sort of managing that process and making the trade-offs of, does this belong as a new thing in the design system or should we remove this option and do something either custom or build it closely with the system?
Yeah, I think as far as like the last question, adoption and, when you think about it, like, you don't necessarily want or need to have everything in the design system. Like, the stuff in the design system should be reusable by any team in any context. And maybe like the cool, flashy new thing that the designer on the search team needs is so specific to search that it's not about building something that's reusable. But what I generally tell people is build every component that you build custom on the site as if it were already in the design system, so that if we get to the point where we put it out there and other teams start using it, we can just copy and paste the markup and the structure and the CSS into the design system, and then everything is in alignment and it makes it much easier. Because, if you build it just kind of any haphazard way, if you're not thinking about, all right, if this is going to eventually be reusable, then we can't port it very easily.
Yeah, that's a tricky balance though, because as you mentioned, like product engineers, one, they're often under tight deadline constraints, and two, they may not even have the perspective of what are all the variables that people might want to change here.
Totally. And I think we have a pretty good setup right now where a lot of those conversations are happening more in design crits, and the designers who work really heavily on the design system go to other teams' crits, and there's a global sort of all of Etsy design does a weekly crit together. So I think it's about having those good relationships outside of the design system world with the actual designers and engineers who are going to be using it, and making sure that there's a really clear, open line of communication.
Yeah, just constant talking, communication, back and forth.
Well, and it's funny because probably one of the busiest customer service channels in our Slack instance is the design systems channel.
Interesting.
People are constantly popping in and asking questions. How do I use this component? I want to do this thing. The designers asked for this. How do I make it happen? So it's a lot. You definitely have to have a very customer service mindset in order to work effectively on a design system team, and relationship building, clear guidelines about contributions. At least at Etsy, our design system kind of represents what we hope, and we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but I like to think that it's our highest ideals for what our front end code should look like. Everything should be perfectly structured. Everything should be perfectly accessible. Everything should be consistently named. Not that we always achieve that because we're humans, but I mean, in my opinion, I think if other people are building stuff in their own stack that follows the kind of lofty ideals and guidelines that we put down for the design system, then they're going to be set up for success regardless. It's not, these are good architectural patterns for everyone. You don't have to be a design systems engineer to think about how do I separate business logic from interaction logic. You know, these are important things everywhere. So
absolutely. Awesome. The only last note I have to talk with you is to highlight what I think you on Twitter you said was your career apex success. You recently were subtweeted by HorseJS.
Yes, that was awesome. Yeah, I was very, very lucky to be invited to MC JSConf US in California.
Nice.
Yeah,
I missed it this year.
Oh, it was so fun. It was my first JSConf actually, so I got thrown in the deep end. But it was amazing. It was so much fun. I really enjoyed MCing. If anybody else wants me to MC their conference, I will come and MC. It was a lot of fun. And I tweeted a picture from backstage, and HorseJS retweeted me like instantly. So I have theories now about. I think I know who HorseJS is. At
JSConf 2 years ago, there was a whole talk about unveiling HorseJS, which they didn't because they staged it. But it was really funny to have them doing that and have HorseJS subtweeting them as they're doing it. So we're like, we know that he or she
was at
JSConf doing this, listening to the talk about unveiling HorseJS. Like, it was
I'm like,
hilarious.
I've actually, the person who I think is HorseJS, I've asked them directly, like, are you HorseJS? And they always say no, but I don't know if I believe them. I've also heard a really good theory that it's not just one person, it's actually a bunch of people. And I think that makes a ton of sense also. But
the data they did expose in that talk seem to indicate that if it is multiple people, they are at least geographically co-located.
Okay.
So,
yeah, but you know,
who knows? HorseJS is still out there.
Geography, come on. So that was probably the highlight of my career. And of course, it wasn't about anything like interesting I said about JavaScript. It was like a picture, but that's okay. I'll take it.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Anything else you want to talk about while we're on?
No, this has been a really awesome conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me, Kevin. It's so great to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me, Katie.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. You too.
All right, thank you for tuning in to JS Party this week. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. And do us a favor, share this show with a friend or just have a podcast. Go into Overcast and favorite it. And thank you to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And we move fast to fix things around here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. We're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Check them out and support this show. Our music is produced by Breakmaster Cylinder. And you can find more shows just like this at changelog.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.